Hi, and welcome to Scale Model Basics. I'm Aaron Skinner, and we're going to be talking about filling seams in this episode. Filling seams is a really important, if basic, technique you need to master if you're going to build clean models. There are three basic materials you can use to fill seams. There are the old school solvent-based putties. These have been around, well, basically since models have been around. There are the newer water-based putties. And then there's superglue. We're going to work through each one of these, show you how to apply them and how to clean up the seams afterwards. We're going to start with the old school solvent-based putties. Now, one of the cautions of these is these are kind of hazardous to your health. Toluene is usually one of the primary ingredients, so it's a good idea to wear gloves while you're working with it. To apply it, take an applicator of some sort. I like these wooden sticks because they're disposable. Squeeze out a little onto your stick. And then you can just drag it along the seam. This stuff is really good for larger gaps and for building up contours because it will hold consistency. The downsides are it does smell pretty bad and it tends to shrink a little as it dries. So you usually want to apply a little bit more than you need along the seam, and then you may need to apply it more than once. Now, the water-based putties can be applied to seams like those in much the same way as the solvent-based putties, but where the water-based putties really excel is on seams like this wing root on this Victor, where you've got a gap that's really difficult to sand. So you can use, this one from Vallejo has a pointy applicator. So I'm gonna put it, it's kind of like you're caulking a window or something. You can squeeze it into the gap, like that. And don't worry about getting outside the lines because there's a really easy way to clean these up after it's on. So make sure you get a good amount in there. And then what I like about this stuff is I can take a Q-tip, dip it in some water, and then you can wipe along the seam and remove most of the excess without ever having to sand. And you can see that there's white along that gap line from that putty. One of the advantages of the water-based putty is it doesn't tend to shrink as much as the solvent-based putties, so you don't have to worry about that aspect as much, particularly when you're filling gaps like these wing roots. Both solvent and water-based putties take time to dry. The water-based putties dry a little quicker than the solvent-based putties, but you want to be sure whichever one you're using, it is good and dry before you try to sand it, because otherwise it has a tendency to peel up or chip as you do that. We've all had that happen, right? So to clean up, it's basically you take a sanding stick and just go across the seam. This is the solvent-based putty here. This is water-based up at the front, just in case anyone was wondering. And you can see that it sands fairly cleanly. And it is, what you want to do is basically sand until you can just see the putty, the white in the seam there. And what's really neat on this one is you can see there were a couple of sink marks here and here. The putties filled those in the process. I didn't notice them in the gray plastic until now. And so you just keep doing that. Then you're going to clean that up like you would any other seam. The same goes for the water base up here. And when you're doing this much sanding work, you're going to mess up panel lines, but we'll get into cleaning those up in another video. So that's pretty much how that works with the different types of putty. Let's go on to one of my personal favorites for filling particularly quick and small gaps, superglue. To use superglue, it's a simple matter to squeeze a little out onto a pallet. And then take an applicator. And you just want to run it along the seam. I'm using a slightly thicker consistency here for gap filling because this is a larger gap. Superglue comes in 3 or 4 different consistencies. There's thin, which is usually fast drying. There's medium viscosity, which they often label as gap filling. And then there's thick, and the thicker it is, the longer it takes to dry normally. But what you want to do is just hold this along and let the capillary action kind of pull it into the seam. And once you're satisfied you've got enough in there, take some accelerator, and I use a little micro brush for this, which seems to have something stuck to it, and just hold it not on the seam itself but next to it and let it run over the super glue. This will set that super glue instantly. So wipe away the excess accelerator, and then you can go ahead and sand this seam like you would any other. And this one is a little harder to tell exactly where it is since the super glue is clear, and you may need to do this more than once on larger seams. One of the advantages of super glue, and the reason I use it a lot for filling gaps, is that it is a quick process. You can apply it, hit it with accelerator, sand it, and you can be ready to paint in a matter of minutes, really. But with that comes a disadvantage. You do not want to let it sit too long before you sand it, because super glue can actually become a little harder than surrounding plastic, and it becomes difficult to sand that seam smooth without damaging the surrounding area. Remember when you're sanding those seams too, to work progressively through the grits from coarse to medium to fine to extra fine, so that that plastic, you're returning the plastic around that gap to be as smooth as the surrounding plastic that hasn't been sanded. You can see how we did that in another video on the site about sanding. Thanks for watching Scale Model Basics. I'm Aaron Skinner, and we'll see you next time.